Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm deeply grateful for this joint hearing that we're going to be conducting here today for the purposes of really getting to the bottom of our relationship with the Compact of Free Association and those states that are so associated. It's important for us in the context of today's hearing to remember that the reputation of the United States as an administering power is no better represented than in our U.S. territories, our tribal nations, and our freely associated allies. And this relationship is wholly responsible for establishing our reputation on the world stage. No matter how much we go out diplomatically to try and talk about whether or not the United States is a good partner or a good ally, it is entirely reflected in whether or not our territories, our tribal nations, and our freely associated allies are succeeding or failing. And the success or failure of these administered areas rests largely with the Department of Interior. And so, Mr. Chairman, I'm very grateful for this hearing so that we can discuss the success, particularly of our freely associated allies and the administering responsibilities of the Department of Interior, because the soft power implications of our ability to get this right has direct relations to our hard power responsibilities in maintaining peace and security throughout the globe. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I'll now recognize the gentleman from Guam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to echo some of the sentiments from my colleague from Hawaii, but maybe be a little bit more pointed in so doing. Mr. Pula, in your response to my chairman on the Natural Resources Committee, when you said that it depends in terms of who you ask with respect to whether or not the U.S. investment into the FAS states was sufficient for them to be able to reach a level of self-sufficiency, I don't think it depends on who you ask. I think it's blatantly obvious that it's been an abject failure. Not only has the corpus of the trust not grown to a level to meet the need of the funding, not only has the grants and technical assistance been sufficient for the areas to be able to reach a level of self-sufficiency not to rely on those fundings, but both of those funding levels have not even factored in the inordinate amount of subsidy that is provided by the host regions, to include the territories, the state of Hawaii, and the others that was mentioned by my colleague. If we had not hosted this level of migration, the corpus and the trust fund and its growth would be even more underwater, and the grants that they're receiving would be even less sufficient. So I don't think there's any debate as to whether or not the compact relationship was sufficient or not for these areas to be able to reach a level of independence. I think it's very, very obvious that it hasn't. On Guam, the population of the FAS residents is more than 2 out of the 4 states that comprise the FSM. It's over 50% of the entire population of the Republic of Palau, and it's over 50% of the entire population on the island of Majuro that is the largest atoll in the Republic of the Marshall Islands. And so the subsidy that's being provided, at least just from Guam, for the compacts and their lack of ability to be able to make up for whatever these areas are needing is enormous. Not only does the population of the FAS make up almost 10% of the population on Guam, but the compact impact fundings that Guam receives is less than 2% of what its overall budget is for its annual fiscal year operations. We get less than 2% of the funding in compact impact for our budget, and our population on the FAS is nearly 10%. So the subsidy is enormous. And we need to factor all those things when we're looking at this on an equal basis. Part of the way for us to be able to move away from the need for subsidy in terms of whether it's being done in host areas or if it's going to be absorbed by more trust funds is to ensure the areas are able to develop to a level that they're not going to be having their population move to areas to get subsidized. And it's also to be able to ensure level of developments that we're not relying on trust fund monies to subsidize the lack of development. But development is grossly lacking in these areas, and I would like to argue due in large part to our inability to necessarily expend the resources that are provided in a way that's going to facilitate that development. And so I wanted to ask specifically about the Joint Economic Management Committee and the Joint Economic Management and Financial Accountability Committee. These 2 committees are responsible for administering the grants that are provided to the FSM and the RMI. With respect to all the grants that have been provided, is there a balance that's basically unexpended in GEMCO and GEMFAC? Mr. Pula?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. Yes, there are balances. It's the funding that we provide.
What's the total value of the balances right now?
Well, let me say this. We'll get that information to you. I can't get it off the top of my head.
Just an estimate, the balances in GEMCO that have been unexpended in terms of grants?
Well, for the FSM, because of the infrastructure slowness of how it went for the FSM, it's I would say it's over $100 million.
Over $100 million in unexpended grants that are supposed to help these areas to develop. How about in
In
GEMFAC?
I would say a few millions dollars, not as much, and those are the unused by the sector grants. Not spent totally, because it's on an annual basis.
If we want to reduce the amount of dependence of these areas, we need to make sure the funding that we're providing to be able to make them more self-sufficient is actually being deployed in order to encourage that self-sufficiency. Secretary Shriver, I just wanted to ask real quick, does the Indo-PACOM strategy factor in a status quo relationship with the FAS?
If I understand the question, it does assume we will continue with that status of freely associated states and compacts. If that status were to change, Indo-Pacific Command would adapt.
And just to close, Mr. Chairman, the need for us to make sure we get the grant deployment right and the need for us to make sure we get these funding levels right is because if we don't and the ground changes out there and we have a change in whether or not China is involved or what have you, is going to cost us exorbitantly more in the adjustments that Indo-PACOM is going to have to make in order to compensate for that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
At this time, I would yield to the gentleman from Guam, Mr. San Nicolas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Zakios and Ambassador Salcea, very nice to see you, my friends. Yokwe Kasilelia, Sijus Maasi for making the time to be with us here today and for all of your advocacy for the region that I know is a very difficult task that you undertake with all of your hearts. Mr. Chairman, I think that the implementation negotiation that we're talking about here today needs to move beyond a continuation discussion, and it needs to include opportunities for our FAS allies to really strengthen to an American standard. When we shortchange the FAS, that is an ultimate reflection of the United States' commitment to its allies, and really, you are the only freely associated allies we have. It is an actual step above almost all of the other diplomatic relationships we have throughout the globe. And so if our freely associated allies are not a reflection of American excellence, then how can we go out as America and truly make the case that embodying American excellence is something that's going to be worthwhile? I think we need to really understand that, and we need to make a commitment to that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to put on the record certain things that I believe we need to consider to include in this implementation agreement in order for our allies to be able to have access to some of the most robust programs that this country has to offer. First of all, Mr. Chairman, we need to make sure that we include the ability for our FAS allies to have access to capital the same way that U.S. territories are able to access that capital. Right now, U.S. territory is able to go out into the bond market and is able to float a triple tax exempt debt that they can use for development. Right now, our FAS allies are stuck in the international bond market, which has exorbitant interest rates compared to what you'd be able to get for a triple tax exempt bond in our domestic markets. Being able to extend access to our domestic markets to our FAS allies would grant them the ability to finance dramatic infrastructure projects that could be life-altering for the people and for the economy of the FAS. They can build schools, they can build hospitals, they can build roads, they can expand their airports, they can grow and develop so they're not dependent on grants and not even dependent on interest from a trust fund. Secondly, Mr. Chairman, we need to look into making sure that our FAS citizens are able to access something that all of the other administered areas under the Department of Interior are able to access, and that's Medicaid. If you live in a territory and you're administered by the Department of Interior, your citizens are able to access Medicaid. If you are a Native American, your tribal government, you're still able to access Medicaid. FAS citizens are the only citizens that are under an administering relationship with the Department of Interior that are not able to access Medicaid. Accessing Medicaid won't just be the extension of a benefit to the freely associated states. It would actually help the host areas in terms of being able to take on the cost of the hosting. On Guam, we're not able to extend Medicaid to freely associated citizens. In Hawaii, they're not able to extend Medicaid to freely associated citizens. So the cost of subsidizing the health care for these citizens is borne at a rate that we're not able to access as if they were full citizens of the United States. So when we have GEMCO and JAMFAC underinvesting in healthcare in the freely associated states, and we have their citizens moving to host areas in order to get that healthcare, they're coming in and they're being subsidized at the full cost of somebody who actually isn't able to access Medicaid. So being able to extend that program will not only help the host areas, but if we can also extend that program into the FAS, perhaps even considering reprogramming grant funding that is sitting in GEMCO and sitting in JAMFAC and having it be used for matching funds for Medicaid, that could actually not only help to fund the healthcare needs of the areas, but it would provide a base level of funding to be able to bring in new service providers and new investment, so we have less need for migration out for the purposes of healthcare. Mr. Chairman, I wanted to put my friends on the record, particularly with GEMCO and JAMFAC, because I believe that that is a reflection of underutilization of existing resources, and I think that we really need to talk about why we're not using the resources that are already provided in order for us to be able to meet the needs of our allies in the freely associated states. So I'll go ahead and start with you, Ambassador Salcea, if I may. Can you elaborate on the amount of funds that is sitting in GEMCO and what the FSM believes is not only the reason for that money sitting there, but the impact for not being able to access those grants?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Congressman San Nicolas. I heard the answer from Director Bula when you asked the same question to him. I know that we have challenges too in our country, FSM, in terms of utilizing the infrastructure funds, mainly the infrastructure fund. Because of several issues, like in some of our states, the government doesn't have eminent domain to lands on which some of these projects are supposed to be built, like schools, dispensaries, and all that. So that is contributing to the delay. But on the other hand, the conditions and the restrictions that are placed by the compact or the fiscal procedures agreement, the subsidiary agreement in the compact, is also contributing to the delay and the backlog of the use of these funds. For instance, the bonding requirements for projects, construction projects, is very prohibitive for companies, local companies in the FSM to bid for these projects. So we end up advertising for companies to come in from Guam or Honolulu or California, and the amount of these projects are not that huge in terms of these companies' profit. So the delay is always finding companies to bid for these projects. So those are, to me, I think those are the bottlenecks that we're facing in terms of implementing these infrastructure funds.
Ambassador.